The United States Federal Marshal didn't bother to knock before slapping the bright orange asset freeze order against the glass wall of my server room. Through the soundproof partition, I watched the blinking green lights of $10 million worth of AI processors hesitate, then go dark one by one as the power was cut. The hum that usually vibrated through the floorboards of Summit Guard Technologies died instantly, replaced by the sickening sound of adhesive tape being smoothed over the door seal. My name is Whitney Irwin, and I am 32 years old. To the United States government, I am the CEO of the only environmental intelligence firm capable of predicting catastrophic avalanches before they bury highways. But to the 3 people sitting on the plaintiff's bench in the federal courthouse this morning, I am nothing more than a rebellious asset that needs to be liquidated. My father, Donald Larson, builds ski resorts on unstable ground because he knows the right people. I build algorithms that prove his ground is unstable because I know the facts. We were never going to coexist peacefully. I smoothed the skirt of my charcoal suit and walked through the heavy double doors of courtroom 4B in Salt Lake City. The air smelled of floor wax and old lies. My husband, Christopher, walked a half step behind me, his hand hovering near the small of my back, not to hold me up, but to remind me that I wasn't fighting this alone. On the left side of the aisle sat the Larson dynasty. My mother, Joan, was already putting on a masterclass in performance art. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, her shoulders shaking just enough to suggest a mother's heartbreak without ruining her mascara. Beside her sat my father, Donald, wearing his disappointed patriarch face, the same expression he wore when I refused to rush a sorority, and the same one he wore when I declined to marry his business partner's son. But the centerpiece of this farce was my older sister, Grace. Grace Larson, the golden child of the Wasatch Front. She was dressed in a soft, modest beige cardigan that looked nothing like the designer leather jacket she usually wore to foreclose on single mothers. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like a charitable saint who had been taken advantage of by her greedy, unstable little sister. They weren't just suing me. They had filed an involuntary bankruptcy petition. It is a nuclear option in the legal world. By claiming I owed them massive unpaid debts, they had triggered an automatic freeze on my company's assets. They knew exactly what they were doing. Summit Guard had just won a $100 million contract with the Bureau of Land Management. That contract required a top-secret security clearance and flawless financial standing. By filing this petition, they weren't just trying to get money. They were trying to trigger a default on my government contract, strip my clearance, and force me to sell my company to them for pennies on the dollar. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a family intervention. I took my seat at the defense table next to my attorney, Emily Castro. Emily didn't look up from her laptop. She was too busy organizing the lethal stack of paper that would eventually end their careers. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Quinn swept into the room. He was a man known for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, which was bad news for my mother. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the docket. In the matter of the involuntary bankruptcy of Whitney Irwin, Judge Quinn read, his voice dry as dust. Petitioners allege the debtor is insolvent and generally not paying debts as they become due. Let's not waste time. Mr. Sterling, call your first witness. The Larson family lawyer, a slick man named Sterling who smelled like expensive cologne in desperation, stood up. "Your Honor, we call Grace Larson to the stand." Grace walked to the witness box, swearing to tell the truth with a hand placed delicately over her heart. She sat down, looked at me with sad, doe-like eyes, and began to spin the web. "I never wanted to do this," Grace said, her voice trembling perfectly. "I love her, but she has always been irresponsible with money. When she was starting her company, she came to me. She was desperate. She said she couldn't make payroll. She said she was going to lose everything." I stared at her, my face a mask of stone. I remembered the years I ate instant noodles and worked 3 jobs so I wouldn't have to ask them for a dime. I remembered building my first server rack in a garage with no heat while Grace was vacationing in Aspen. "And you helped her?" Sterling asked gently. "I did." Grace nodded, a tear finally escaping. "I loaned her everything I had saved, $2 million. It was my trust fund, my savings, everything. She promised to pay me back as soon as she got her first contract. That was 4 years ago." "And did she sign an agreement?" "Yes," Grace sniffled. "She did." Sterling approached the bench with a dramatic flourish. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, a promissory note dated 4 years ago, signed by Whitney Irwin, acknowledging a debt of $2 million to Grace Larson." The bailiff handed the document to Emily, who placed it between us. I looked down at the object that was supposed to destroy my life. It was pathetic. It was a single sheet of printer paper, slightly crumpled, with a circular brown coffee stain on the bottom right corner. The text was simple, typed in a standard font, stating that I, Whitney Irwin, unconditionally promised to repay Grace Larson the sum of $2 million plus interest. And there, at the bottom, was my signature. Or at least it looked like my signature. It had the sharp W and the trailing Y that I used. To the naked eye, it was perfect. It was the kind of forgery that takes practice, the kind of practice you get when you grow up forging your parents' signatures on report cards because you got a B+ instead of an A. She signed it right at my kitchen table, Grace continued, her confidence growing as the judge examined the paper. She was crying, thanking me for saving her life. I just want my money back, Your Honor. My parents and I, we just want to help her get structural help. She's clearly unwell. My father nodded solemnly from the bench, playing the role of the burdened protector. He caught my eye and gave me a look that I knew well. It was the look that said, "Give up, Whitney. Come back to the fold. Let us control you and this pain stops." They thought this was checkmate. They thought by freezing my accounts and waving a forged paper in federal court, I would panic. They expected the old Whitney, the one who sought their approval, the one who folded to keep the peace, to crumble, settle the case, and hand over the keys to Summit Guard, just to make the public humiliation stop. They had no idea that the Whitney D. Mew died the day Grace stole my first startup idea 7 years ago. I looked at the coffee stain on the paper. Then I looked at the date typed at the top, November 14th, 2019. A cold, sharp calm settled over me. It was the feeling of clarity I got when looking at raw data sets, seeing the pattern that everyone else missed. I turned to Christopher. He was already looking at me, his eyes hard and bright. He gave the slightest nod. He knew. Emily Castro leaned over to me, her voice a whisper that sounded like a blade sliding out of a sheath. They just testified to the authenticity of this document under oath. They are locked in. I know, I whispered back. I looked back at Grace in the witness box. She was dabbing her eyes again, soaking up the sympathy of the courtroom. She thought she was the hunter. She thought the crumpled paper with the coffee stain was her weapon. She didn't realize it was her confession. I sat back in my chair and let a small ghost of a smile touch my lips. The asset freeze on my servers hurt, yes. The cease and desist was inconvenient. But as I watched my family gloat in their premature victory, I realized that I wasn't the one who was bankrupt. The trap had been set, and they had just walked right into the center of it. To understand why I didn't panic when Grace lied to a federal judge, you have to understand the specific anatomy of my family's betrayal. It didn't start with this lawsuit. It started 7 years ago with a flash drive. Back then, I was naive. I had coded a prototype for an algorithm called SlopeSense, the precursor to Summit Guard. I made the mistake of showing it to my father at dinner, hoping for a shred of validation. He didn't understand the math, but Grace did. Or rather, she understood the valuation. 2 weeks later, Grace launched Alpine Analytics using my exact source code.
When I confronted my parents, my mother didn't deny it. She just poured her wine and said, "Whitney, your sister needs a win right now. You're strong. You can build something else. Let her have this." That was the moment I realized my role in the Larson family wasn't daughter. It was fuel. I was something to be burned so Grace could stay warm. I walked out that night and never took a penny from them again. I built Summit Guard Technologies from the ground up, eating ramen and coding in a basement apartment until my eyes bled. Fast forward to 6 months ago. Summit Guard landed the Whiteout contract, a $100 million deal with the Bureau of Land Management to monitor soil stability in the Rockies. My data was irrefutable, and my data showed that Silver Peaks, my father's massive planned luxury resort, was sitting on a dormant landslide zone. If my data was published, his permits would be revoked, his investors would walk, the Larson dynasty would lose $50 million in sunk costs. That is why we were in court. They didn't want my money. They wanted to bury my credibility so they could bury the truth about their land. But they made a fatal error. They assumed that because I was a tech geek, I didn't understand finance. I thought back to 48 hours ago, sitting in the glass-walled conference room of my attorney, Emily Castro. The city lights of Salt Lake reflected on the table as we stared at the copy of the promissory note my sister had included in her filing. "It looks authentic," Emily had said, her voice tight. "If they have a handwriting expert who will testify this is your signature, we have a problem, Whitney. Involuntary bankruptcy requires proof you aren't paying debts. A $2 million defaulted loan is a smoking gun." I felt the familiar cold rage tightening my chest. "I didn't sign it, Emily. I haven't taken money from them in 7 years. "I believe you," Emily said, tapping her pen, "but federal court runs on evidence, not belief. We need to prove it's a forgery, and that is hard to do when it's a digital copy." My husband, Christopher, had been silent for 20 minutes, pacing the length of the room. Christopher isn't a lawyer, he's a forensic data architect. He doesn't look at words, he looks at patterns. "Stop looking at the signature," Christopher said, halting mid-stride. "Look at the payment instructions." He pointed to the bottom of the document, where the lender, Grace, had listed the wire transfer details for repayment. "Bank of the West, account number 8842901153. "What about it?" Emily asked. "I ran a syntax check on the account structure," Christopher said, sliding his tablet across the table. "Most people think bank account numbers are random. They aren't. They follow a checksum algorithm, specifically the modulus 10 system, to prevent data entry errors. It's impossible to just invent a number that works unless you know the specific bank's weighting factor." I looked at the screen. The numbers were glowing red. "The account number Grace typed on that note fails the checksum for Bank of the West," a dark smile forming. "It is a mathematical impossibility. That account number cannot exist at that bank. It's a ghost account." I felt the air shift in the room. "She made it up," I whispered. "She needed the document to look official, so she mashed a bunch of numbers on the keyboard to fill the account number field, thinking nobody would check the math." "Exactly," Christopher said. "She created a debt that was supposed to be paid to an account that never existed." Emily Castro sat back, her eyes widening. "If the account doesn't exist, the loan terms are fraudulent on their face, but it gets better." Emily pulled a file from her briefcase. "I had a hunch, so I ran a background check on the notary stamp Grace used on the document. The notary is a woman named Linda Holloway." "I don't know a Linda Holloway," Emily replied. "At least not anymore. Linda Holloway's commission expired in 2018. This note is dated November 2019. She stamped it with an invalid seal." The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent click. My family, and their arrogance and haste to destroy me, have been sloppy. They were so used to bullying people with money that they had forgotten how to lie with precision. Then came the final insult.
The night before the trial, my phone had buzzed. It was a text from Grace. "Just admit you failed, Whit. Dad can fix this if you sign the rights to Summit Guide over to the trust. We can make the lawsuit go away. Don't make Mom watch you go to prison for fraud. Love you." I stared at that text for a long time. They were projecting. They were accusing me of fraud while submitting forged documents to a federal court. In Emily's office, I had looked at my lawyer. Do we file a motion to dismiss? Do we show the judge the fake account number and the expired notary right now? Emily had closed the folder slowly. No. Why not? "Because if we move to dismiss now, they just withdraw the petition," Emily said, her voice turning cold. "They claim it was a clerical error. They get a slap on the wrist, and they come after you again in 6 months with a better lie." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "If you want to end this, Whitney, really end it, we have to let them finish the crime. We need Grace to take the stand. We need her to swear under oath that she typed those numbers. We need her to testify that she watched you sign it. We need to let them commit federal perjury on the record." "It's a risk," Christopher warned, "if the judge believes them before we get to the rebuttal." "He won't," I said. The decision settled in my gut like a heavy stone. Let them talk. Let them tell the whole story. I don't just want to win the case, Emily. I want to burn the bridge so thoroughly that even the ash blows away. Back in the courtroom, Grace was finishing her performance. She wiped a tear from her cheek and looked up at Judge Quinn. "I just want my sister to get help," she whispered. "That $2 million was my future, and she stole it." "Thank you, Miss Larson," Sterling said, radiating smug satisfaction. "Your witness." Emily Castro stood up. She didn't pick up a stack of papers. She picked up a single, bright red folder. She walked toward the witness stand with a rhythmic clicking of her heels that sounded like a countdown. Grace smiled at her, confident and untouchable. She had no idea that the numbers she had typed on that page were coordinates for her own destruction. "Miss Larson," Emily began, her voice pleasant and terrifyingly calm,
You stated that you personally drafted this promissory note, is that correct? Yes, Grace said. And you are certain, absolutely certain, that the details within it are accurate? I am, Grace replied, snapping the trap shut around her own neck. I looked at my father. He was checking his watch, probably calculating how long until he could acquire my company's assets. He didn't see the red folder. He didn't see the cliff edge. But he was about to feel the fall. Emily Castro held the red folder against her chest like a shield, her expression unreadable. She stood just a few feet from Grace, who sat in the witness box radiating the kind of smug confidence that usually precedes a catastrophic fall. Miss Larson, Emily said, her voice deceptively light, you just testified that you personally typed this promissory note on November 14th, 2019. You also testified that you witnessed my client, Whitney Irwin, sign it. Is that correct? Yes, Grace said, smoothing her beige cardigan. I remember it vividly. It was a very emotional day for our family. I can imagine, Emily said. She paused, glancing briefly at the defense table where Christopher and I sat stone still. And given the significant amount of money involved, $2 million, did anyone else witness this signing? Grace didn't hesitate. She gestured grandly to the plaintiff's bench. My parents were both there. We held an intervention for Whitney in my father's study. We all watched her sign it. We all wanted to make sure she felt supported. Emily nodded slowly. So if called to the stand, your parents would corroborate that this specific document with these specific payment terms was executed in their presence? Absolutely, Grace said, her eyes narrowing slightly at Emily's tone. Thank you, Miss Larson. I have no further questions at this time, but we reserve the right to recall the witness. Grace blinked, clearly confused. She had braced herself for a fight, for an accusation of forgery, for screaming. Instead, Emily simply walked back to our table and sat down. Grace stepped out of the box, shooting a triumphant look at her mother as she passed. She thought Emily had folded.
She thought the document was so perfect that we couldn't find a way to attack it. She didn't realize that Emily wasn't retreating, she was reloading. Mr. Sterling, Judge Quinn said, looking over his spectacles, call your next witness. We call Joan Larson, Sterling announced. My mother rose from the bench. As she walked to the stand, she dabbed her eyes again, preparing for the performance of a lifetime. She took the oath, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. Sterling walked her through the rehearsed script. Mrs. Larson, can you describe the day your daughter signed this note? It was heartbreaking, my mother said, looking directly at me with eyes full of practiced sorrow. Whitney was manic. She was begging Grace for the money. She said Summit Guard was going under. We told her we would help, but we needed it in writing this time. We've given her so much over the years. I gripped the edge of the table. The only thing they had given me over the years was a complex about my own worth and a masterclass in gaslighting. And you saw her sign Exhibit A? Sterling asked. I did, my mother lied, her voice gaining strength. I stood right beside her. I saw her hand shake as she wrote her name. I saw Grace hand her the check and initiate the first wire transfer right there on her laptop. Thank you, Mrs. Larson, Sterling said. Emily stood up for cross-examination. She didn't bring the folder this time. She just leaned against the defense table, casual and dangerous. Mrs. Larson, Emily asked, you mentioned you saw Grace initiate the wire transfer. Did you happen to see the account number she typed in? My mother hesitated for a fraction of a second. She didn't know the number was fake. She only knew she had to back up Grace's story. I don't recall the specific digits, but I saw the confirmation screen. I saw the money leave Grace's account. So you are testifying under oath to the existence of that transaction? I am, my mother said, chin raised. No further questions. My mother stepped down, looking relieved. She squeezed my father's hand as he stood up to take her place. Donald Larson didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He walked to the stand with the heavy, authoritative gait of a man who owns half the mountains in Summit County. He sat down, adjusted his suit jacket, and looked at Judge Quinn as if they were peers at a country club. Mr. Larson, Sterling asked, why did you feel it was necessary to force your daughter into bankruptcy? It wasn't a choice I made lightly, my father said, his voice deep and grave. But Whitney is spiraling. This debt to Grace, it's just the tip of the iceberg. She's mismanaging Summit Guard. As a father, I have a duty to step in before she destroys herself and the livelihood of her employees. If taking control of her assets is the only way to save her, then that is the burden I must bear. It was sickeningly convincing. If I didn't know him, if I didn't know he was currently trying to bulldoze a protected watershed for a ski lift, I might have believed him myself. And you also witnessed the signing of the promissory note? I did, my father said firmly. I reviewed the terms myself. Standard interest, 2-year maturity. It was a generous loan, and she signed it right in front of me. Thank you, Mr. Larson, Sterling said. Emily didn't even stand up this time.
No questions for this witness, Your Honor. My father frowned as he stepped down. The lack of fight for my legal team was making him nervous. He was a predator. He sensed when the prey wasn't running, and it unsettled him. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the petitioner's rest. We have established the debt, the default, and the insolvency. We ask that the court grant the petition for involuntary bankruptcy immediately. The courtroom fell silent. The air was thick with the weight of 3 separate perjuries, stacked one on top of the other like kindling waiting for a match. They had all sworn to it. They had all tied themselves to the anchor. Judge Quinn turned to Emily. Ms. Castro, does the defense have a case? Emily stood up slowly. She picked up the red folder again. This time she opened it. We do, Your Honor, Emily said, her voice ringing off the mahogany walls. But we won't be calling any witnesses to refute the testimony you just heard. My father frowned as he stepped down. The lack of fight for my legal team was making him nervous. He was a predator. He sensed when the prey wasn't running, and it unsettled him. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the petitioner's rest. We have established the debt, the default, and the insolvency. We ask that the court grant the petition for involuntary bankruptcy immediately. The courtroom fell silent. The air was thick with the weight of 3 separate perjuries, stacked one on top of the other like kindling waiting for a match. They had all sworn to it. They had all tied themselves to the anchor.
Instead, Emily continued, walking toward the center of the room, I would like to recall Grace Larson to the stand, and I would like to direct the court's attention to the specific banking coordinates listed on Exhibit A, the document all 3 petitioners just swore under oath was authentic. I looked at Christopher. He touched his watch. It was time. Grace walked back to the witness stand, but the bounce was gone from her step. She sat down, smoothing her beige cardigan, but her eyes darted between Emily Castro and the red folder resting on the lectern. She looked like an animal that had just realized the trap wasn't the metal cage around her, but the air she was breathing. Emily didn't shout. She didn't pace. She simply opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in dense data tables. Ms. Larson, Emily said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, please look at the document you submitted as Exhibit A. Specifically, the repayment instructions at the bottom. Could you read the account number you claim belongs to you? Grace squinted at her own forgery. 884-290-1153. Thank you, Emily said. She picked up the paper from her folder. This is an affidavit from the senior fraud analyst at Bank of the West. It explains a system called Modulus 10. It is an algorithm banks use to generate account numbers. It ensures that a random string of digits cannot accidentally be a valid account. Grace shifted in her seat. I don't see what this has to do with. It has everything to do with it, Emily cut in, her voice sharpening. Because according to the bank's own algorithm, the number you just read, the number you swore under oath you wired money from, is mathematically impossible. It does not exist. It cannot exist. It is a ghost account. A murmur rippled through the gallery. My father stiffened on the bench, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I must have mistyped it, Grace stammered, a flush creeping up her neck. I was stressed. It was a typo. A typo? Emily asked, raising an eyebrow. Ms. Larson, 5 minutes ago you and your mother both testified under oath that you successfully initiated a wire transfer using these exact coordinates. You cannot wire money to a typo. The banking system rejects it instantly. So did you lie about the account number, or did you lie about the transfer? We sent the money, Grace shouted, her voice cracking. Then let's talk about where my sister was when she supposedly signed this note, Emily said, pulling a second document from the red folder. You testified that on November 14th, 2019, Whitney Irwin was sitting at your kitchen table in Salt Lake City, crying and signing this document. She was, Grace insisted, looking at our parents for support. We were all there. Emily turned and walked toward the projector screen. Exhibit D, she announced. Cellular triangulation data and credit card receipts for Whitney Irwin, dated November 14th, 2019. The screen lit up. It wasn't a map of Utah. It was a map of Washington, D.C. On the day you claim my client was in your kitchen, Emily said, pointing to the timestamps, she was 2,000 miles away, presenting at a cybersecurity conference in the capital. Here is a receipt for a coffee she bought at Dulles Airport at 8 in the morning. Here is her hotel check-in at 4 in the afternoon. Unless your kitchen table is inside the Smithsonian, Ms. Larson, you are lying. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing shut. My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. This is ridiculous. We are trying to help her. Sit down, Mr. Larson, Judge Quinn barked, slamming his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Donald Larson froze. He wasn't used to being told to sit down. He looked at Sterling, his expensive lawyer, but Sterling was currently busy trying to distance himself from his own clients, staring at his shoes as if they were the most interesting things in the world. "Ms. Castro," Judge Quinn said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have anything else?" "Just one last thing, Your Honor," Emily said. She pulled a transparent overlay from the folder. "We had a forensic document examiner analyze the signature on the note. It is a 99% match for Whitney's signature."
Grace let out a breath of relief. "See, I told you she signed it." "However," Emily continued, holding up the overlay, "it is a 100% match for a signature Whitney used on a birthday card she sent to Grace in 2018. When you overlay them, they are identical down to the pixel. No person signs their name exactly the same way twice. The only way this happens is a digital copy-paste." Emily dropped the folder onto the table. The thud echoed in the dead silence. "This document is a forgery," Emily declared, turning to face the Larson family. "The debt is a fiction, the bank account is a phantom, and this bankruptcy petition is a fraudulent instrument filed to harass a federal contractor." Grace was trembling now, actual tears streaming down her face, stripping away the modest act. I just wanted..." She looked at our mother. "Mom?" Joan Larson was staring straight ahead, her face pale as a sheet. She knew. She realized that the tearful performance she gave 10 minutes ago wasn't just a lie anymore. It was a felony. Judge Quinn removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He let the silence stretch for 10 long seconds, letting the weight of the federal government press down on the three people who thought they owned the world. "In 20 years on the bench," Judge Quinn said, his voice quiet and terrifying, "I have seen greed. I have seen malice. But rarely have I seen such a clumsy, arrogant attempt to weaponize this court." He leaned forward, looking directly at Grace. "Miss Larson, you walked into my courtroom, took an oath, and fabricated a financial transaction to destroy your sister's livelihood. You drafted a fake note. You invented a bank account. And you dragged your parents up here to corroborate your lie." "Your Honor, please," Sterling tried to interject, his voice weak. "Mr. Sterling, if you say one more word, I will hold you in contempt," Quinn snapped. He turned his gaze to my father. "Donald Larson, you sat there and testified that you witnessed this signing. You looked me in the eye and lied to protect a fraud." My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. He slumped back onto the bench, the imposing patriarch reduced to a terrified old man. "I am dismissing this petition with prejudice," Judge Quinn announced, grabbing his gavel. "But I am not done. I am referring this entire transcript, along with Ms. Castro's evidence, to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Utah. You came here looking for a judgment. You're going to get an indictment." Bang. The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. Pandemonium broke out. The bailiff moved toward the plaintiff's bench, not to arrest them yet, but to ensure they didn't leave before the marshals could take their statements. Grace was sobbing openly now, ugly, heving sobs that echoed off the high ceiling. My mother was gripping my father's arm so hard her knuckles were white. I stood up. I felt light, as if gravity had released its hold on me for the first time in 32 years. Christopher squeezed my hand. "It's over." "Not yet," I said. I walked past the defense table. I walked across the aisle. I stopped right in front of the little wooden gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. My father looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a mixture of shock and hatred. He looked at me like I was the villain, like I was the one who had betrayed them by refusing to be their victim. I leaned in close, so only he could hear me, over the sound of his ruin. "You should have stuck to real estate, Dad," I whispered, my voice steady and cold. "You're terrible at fiction." I turned around and walked out of the courtroom, the sound of my sister's wailing fading behind the heavy double doors. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me but a burning bridge, and I had the only match. 6 months after the gavel came down in Salt Lake City, the first heavy snow of the season buried the Wasatch Range. From the deck of my A-frame cabin, I watched the white powder settle on the ridgeline, land that was supposed to be the lobby of my father's Silver Peaks resort. Instead, it remained a silent, untouched wilderness,
guarded by the sensors my company installed last week. I took a sip of black coffee and looked down at the tablet resting on my lap.
The headline of the Salt Lake Tribune said it all. Larson plea deal. Real estate heiress admits to federal bankruptcy fraud. Grace didn't go to prison. 3 years of probation, $100,000 in restitution fines, and a permanent ban from holding a real estate license or serving as an officer of any public company. The golden child was now a convicted felon. She was currently living in a rented condo in Provo, working as an administrative assistant for a pool cleaning company, the only job she could get that didn't require a background check involving financial clearance. My parents fared even worse. When the news of the perjury referral hit, the investors for the Silver Peaks Resort panicked. They pulled their funding overnight. Without the capital to cover the massive loans Donald had taken out to start excavation, the project collapsed. Then came the lawsuits. It turns out, when you lie to a federal judge, your business partners assume you're lying to them too. They audited Donald's books and found years of corners cut. The irony was poetic. In their attempt to force me into involuntary bankruptcy, they had triggered their own very real, very voluntary Chapter 7 liquidation. The Larson dynasty was sold off for parts last month. Their house on the hill, the cars, the country club memberships, gone to pay the lawyers they hired to destroy me. The glass door slid open, and Christopher stepped out, carrying a small stack of firewood. He sat down beside me, watching the snowfall. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," I said. "I'm free." Summit Guard Technologies had just renewed the BLM contract for another 5 years. My security clearance was upgraded to top secret. We were expanding into avalanche monitoring for the Swiss Alps next quarter. The asset freeze on my servers had lasted exactly 48 hours, but the message I sent to the industry had lasted much longer. Do not come for Whitney Irwin unless you have the data to back it up. I reached into the pocket of my fleece jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a digital copy. It was the original certified court order Judge Quinn had signed that day. Case number 24-009, dismissed with prejudice, referral for criminal investigation. I walked over to the wood stove in the corner of the deck. I opened the iron door and felt the heat of the fire on my face. For years, I had held on to the hope that my family would eventually see me. I thought if I became successful enough, smart enough, or strong enough, they would finally respect me. I realize now that respect was never the currency they traded in. They only traded in control. And when they couldn't control me, they tried to delete me. I tossed the court order into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished into smoke, rising up toward the clean mountain air. I watched it burn, feeling the last tether to the name Larson disintegrate. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the woman who turned their fire into my own fuel. Christopher put his arm around me. "What now?" "Now," I said, watching the snow cover the mountains I had saved. "We get back to work. If you are watching this and you have a family member who demands you set yourself on fire to keep them warm, listen to me. Hand them a blanket, walk away, and lock the door. You don't owe your future to the people who are threatened by your success. Real family isn't about whose blood you share. It's about who stands beside you when the subpoena arrives. I'm Whitney Irwin. I built my own table, I cooked my own meal, and I didn't let them take a single crumb. Thanks for reading my story. If you've ever had to outsmart a toxic relative to save your own life, drop a comment below and tell me how you did it. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the best revenge isn't just living well, it's succeeding so loudly that they can't help but hear it.